Hello, I'm Isaac Kardon, and this is the World Unpacked. Today, I am delighted to host on this podcast a dear friend and colleague, Ankit Panda, who is the Stanton Senior Fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and who has recently published an excellent book called The New Nuclear Age: At the Precipice of Armageddon, out with Polity Press and available in the show notes and at every major bookseller. Before we dive in, I just want to put in a strong endorsement for this book. It is truly an accomplishment and something that everybody in the think tank space should aspire to do. He's writing with clear language and compelling storytelling and layering in really sophisticated knowledge and context that renders a really complex and weighty subject of nuclear strategy, nuclear deterrence into accessible terms and makes what strike me as sane prescriptions, all underpinned by a sort of ethical standard about wanting to avoid this Armageddon that he so artfully discusses in the title of the book. So I guess the first thing to say is this is a very comprehensive approach to the question of nuclear strategy, and it has a major historical component and then really focuses quite heavily on some of the major areas in which there are potential nuclear exchanges in the contemporary environment. So I kind of want to start us first with understanding that historical sweep and then move into some of the individual cases where nuclear use is unfortunately conceivable. You talk about a new nuclear age, and this is the third such period in the 80-year history of the bomb. I wonder if you could sketch the arc of the first two nuclear ages and explain how we ended up here at the precipice of Armageddon, as you put it.
Well, thanks a lot, Isaac, for that very generous introduction and for your endorsement of the book. I really appreciate it. I think this is exactly the right place to start because the book makes the argument that nuclear weapons are back at the center of international politics. And so to understand the reasons why that has happened and the ways in which that is happening, you have to understand where we were. And look, the first thing I'll say is this whole idea of nuclear ages is very much disputed. I mean, it's an intellectual framework that I'm using in the book to help us make sense of the role that nuclear weapons play in statecraft. You could make the case that there's only one nuclear age that matters, which is the nuclear age that began in 1945 with the Trinity test, the use of nuclear weapons against Imperial Japan in the final days of the Second World War. But I use that as the starting point for what I call the first nuclear age and what is generally accepted to be the first nuclear age, which is that period where humanity discovers the bomb begins to proliferate. The United States and the Soviet Union, as the two main protagonists of the Cold War, together discover nuclear strategy in their idiosyncratic interpretations of what that means. They too, they have divergent impressions and objectives at times. The bomb begins to proliferate. And in the second half of the Cold War, really the big story is rendering this enterprise of nuclear deterrence, what the American navalist Bernard Brodie once called the absolute weapon, the weapon that so fundamentally revolutionized warfare that militaries were no longer charged in the countries that possessed these weapons in fighting and winning wars, but in avoiding them altogether. The second half of the Cold War is a story of rendering the enterprise of deterrence safer, putting some guardrails, right? Everybody's familiar on some level with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even if they don't know the details, they probably know that that was the most dangerous moment of the nuclear age writ large. And it's after that moment that the U.S. and the Soviet Union do quite a bit. They, despite being adversaries, come together to promulgate a non-proliferation treaty that is among the most successful measures in arms control in history. It's one of the reasons we only have 9 countries with nuclear weapons today instead of, as President Kennedy once feared, ending the 20th century with 25 countries. They did arms control together. And that brought us to the end of the Cold War, which, of course, wasn't resolved by nuclear weapons, but was resolved as the Soviet Union collapsed and disappeared. And so that's the transition to what many have called the second nuclear age, which is, broadly speaking, a moment of optimism globally. Nuclear weapons don't go away after the Cold War ends, but the shadow they cast over humanity recedes, is how I describe it. But of course, this is a period when new anxieties emerge. The bomb does continue to proliferate. India, Pakistan, the Korean Peninsula, where North Korea starts working on the bomb in the 1990s. All of these are pertinent concerns. The United States, of course, invades Iraq on the suspicion of the possession of WMD. But, we also indefinitely extended the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, later Russia, pulled back. Thousands of nuclear weapons deployed outside of their borders. Global nuclear numbers come down, right? We go from 70,000 nuclear weapons in the 1980s to a world in which today we have around 12.5 to 13,000 nuclear weapons. So that's the broader story of the second nuclear age. Unfortunately, that brings us to where we are now, and a lot of what I've just described has given way to a far more competitive, intense, and dangerous period of multipolar competition, technological change, and regression in global order and institutions around nuclear weapons.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit more about the characteristics of this third stage in the evolution of nuclear dynamics in the international system. And one of the ways of conceptualizing it that you offered that I found really interesting is this idea of a three-body problem, which is to say we're not just thinking about this nuclear dyad of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but we're at least considering China now in that class, and then maybe more broadly beyond the three-body problem, just some of the issues in technology that have brought us to a point where maybe we are less confident in the ways of deterrence that we developed over the course of that first and second period of nuclear strategy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Cold War, as I said, was a period where you had two large protagonists, the United States and the Soviet Union. And it would be ahistorical to describe that as an easy moment for humanity. But generally speaking, from an intellectual perspective at least, thinking about what stability means when you have two players, and you have two players that are at least willing to talk to each other, as the U.S. and the Soviet Union eventually did, humanity got pretty lucky because we were able to ultimately do arms control with the Soviet Union. We had mutual anxieties that created mutual interest. We had interest in Washington and Moscow that brought us together. Today we have a third player. This is a nuclear age that is emerging against the backdrop of China's tremendous rise on all measures of national power. This is the big story of the last 30 years. Economically, militarily, societally, in terms of global institutions, China is a much more capable player. And in recent years, that has now spilled over into the domain of nuclear weapons. Under the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, there appears to have been a wholesale rethink of the role that nuclear weapons can and should play in China's national defense strategy. Despite all of its measures of national power increasing, China for decades, well into the 2010s, maintained a nuclear arsenal that was rather small by the standards of what the United States deploys. China had, according to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency in 2019, a nuclear arsenal measuring low 200s in terms of the number of warheads. Today, the U.S. assesses that that's going to go up to 1,500 by the mid-2030s. And viewed from Washington, what this does is it creates an unprecedented problem, which is that the United States now has to think about accomplishing its national goals and accomplishing its nuclear deterrence objectives in a world where it's not just Russia that the U.S. is worried about, but also a much more capable China. There's this term in American nuclear strategy jargon that used to be used to encapsulate how American military planners would think about the China nuclear problem, which was this phrase, lesser included case. What does that mean? It meant that any American nuclear force that could accomplish U.S. goals vis-a-vis Russia could inherently do the same vis-a-vis China. And as China builds up to 1,500, that assumption is no longer holding. And you mentioned the three-body problem, which is this idea from classical mechanics that when you have phenomena involving two physical bodies orbiting each other, the behavior is predictable, and there is a stable equilibrium that is fairly easy to define. If you introduce a third body, that phenomena starts to become less predictable, far more chaotic, and equilibria are not as easily found. And that's a pretty good analogy for the ways in which we have to now think about nuclear stability. And of course, complicating matters is the political relationship between Russia and China, which is, of course, contested, the extent to which the two countries are aligned, whether they are best described as being in an entente or an alliance. But viewed from Washington, this is a far more challenging nuclear world. And we're also looking now at the end of U.S.-Russia strategic arms control. The last remaining arms control agreement between these two countries, the New START agreement, which was negotiated under the Obama administration, will expire next February 2026. And after that moment, there will be nothing standing between an increase in the size of the U.S. and Russian arsenals. So regrettably, I think we are looking for the first time since the 1990s at a world where the number of deployed nuclear weapons will begin to increase for reasons of geopolitics, for reasons of technological anxiety, strategic anxiety, and a broader perception that interstate war, including among and between the nuclear armed states, is going to be more possible.
Yeah, and I guess the overlay on this that want to weave into our understanding of what is so problematic about the current era has to do with some of the delivery systems and types of warheads and other sort of auxiliary technologies like AI or quantum computing that may complicate or undermine some of the reasoning underlying deterrence practice in the past. What should we understand about this new era in terms of the technologies available?
Yeah, so let me first say two things about technology, right? So the first thing to say is that nuclear weapons, humanity developed nuclear weapons precisely at a moment where we were about to head into decades of extremely rapid technological and industrial change. The missile age arrived not long after the advent of nuclear weapons. The space age arrived not long after the advent of nuclear weapons. For our Cold War predecessors in the world of nuclear strategy, these were dramatic technological changes. This idea that what had been an hours-long lurch to nuclear war, when nuclear weapons could only be delivered by very slow, large bombers. The moment you had a ballistic missile that could range the entirety of the world or halfway around the world in about 30 minutes, that was a revolution that mandated some level of thinking about what that would mean for the strategic balance. So that's the first point, which is that technological change has been endemic to the nuclear age writ large. The second observation is that technological change itself is agnostic for nuclear stability, and oftentimes new technologies present opportunities for rendering nuclear deterrent capabilities more survivable. But on the flip side, they can also threaten the survivability of nuclear forces. And survivability is really the key framework I use in the book for the reader. I try to ask the reader to imagine essentially the stabilizing condition that benefits stable nuclear deterrence, which is that you have nuclear weapons, I have nuclear weapons, we might not like each other, our nuclear weapons might be pointed at each other, but as long as I know your weapons are going to be survivable, that I can't destroy them all no matter what I try to do, and you know the same about me, we have no reason to go to nuclear war against each other. That's essentially what sometimes in the popular imagination is described as the condition of mutually assured destruction. But let's say I build a Golden Dome, an exquisite missile defense system, or I build an artificial intelligence that is so capable that in a time of war, it can find all of your submarines and all of your mobile missiles. That shifts the balance. And that's essentially the conversation about technology in the book. It's that, is this likely to happen? The answer is maybe and perhaps. We just do not know, especially for artificial intelligence. As I was writing this book, the large language model phenomenon took off, and month by month, week by week, as new frontier models came out, the conversation globally about what AI could or could not do was changing very quickly. And so I also try to maintain a level of humility about my ability to foresee these things. But the broader observation is that in space, under the ocean, in cyberspace, things are changing very quickly. And while technological change has been endemic, the multiple domains of change today and the many vectors of change, the rapid pace of change, the well-known phenomena that technological change will outpace the ability of governments to keep pace with that change, all of this adds a new layer of complexity. And arms control, it turns out, is actually very difficult to do in some of these domains. For instance, cyber capabilities, by definition, are unrevealed in times of peace. They are to be revealed in a time of war to accomplish their effects. And so you can't really count cyber weapons or do on-site inspections or think about some of the traditional modalities we used during the Cold War, where we counted things and limited things to specific geographical locations. So there's a lot there, but it's hopefully something that the reader takes away from the book was another really important part of this third nuclear age we're now in.
Yeah, and a sort of open invitation of people working in these technologies to start thinking about how they apply in this space. And I'll just add, kind of parenthetically, as someone who's focused on China and in particular some of the potentials for military conflicts in East Asia, it has been, I think, problematically too easy to just bracket that problem and think about conventional types of escalation. And ultimately, it's very, very difficult to understand the strategic dynamics between any of the great powers or any of the nuclear armed powers, of which there are now 9, without considering how that kind of shadow of the potential for nuclear use hangs over it. So we will get into China in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about the potential for stability in nuclear relations. And I believe this is what you described as the nuclear revolution, this development, at least in theory, of a sense that mutually assured destruction would produce a stable outcome in terms of deterrence, or at least that conceptually it would. And I'm kind of curious who are the committed revolutionaries now who are still advancing this idea that can hold, and has there been what you might think of as a counter-revolution, particularly as encapsulated in this idea of ballistic missile defenses, but perhaps in other ways, and then we can definitely touch on the wisdom or unwisdom of a golden dome in the U.S. context. But I want to get a sense of this conceptually first. What's the nuclear revolution? Is there a counter-revolution? What's the balance of power in that race?
Yeah, so the nuclear revolution is essentially a theoretical idea that describes the role that nuclear weapons should play in international statecraft when countries possess these capabilities. What happens when A and B, you and I, possess nuclear weapons? Well, it deprives us of incentives to go to war. But even if we do go to war, we both understand that there's a very good reason to end that war very quickly before things get out of hand. And so generally speaking, it should have a mollifying effect. It should facilitate peace. But of course, there's a bit of a puzzle here, because in the real world we know that intense competitive dynamics, including a proxy conflict right now between NATO and Russia, are playing out, and the nuclear revolution, turns out, does not solve all of our problems. Because, as you sort of nicely put it, there are counter-revolutionaries, right? Real governments, real leaders, do not like this condition of mutually assured destruction. It is not a pleasant condition to be deterred. It is not a pleasant condition to have one's room for maneuver politically to be limited by nuclear deterrence. Right? I think we had this debate in the United States in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and there were calls to, save Ukrainian lives by putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine. But then, of course, many, including people in the Biden administration, had to point out that that would largely risk a potentially uncontrollable path to direct military confrontation and potentially nuclear escalation with Russia. But coming back to the counter-revolutionary idea, during the Cold War, a big part of the story wasn't, despite the popular imagination, that mutually assured destruction solved the problem of nuclear deterrence, but that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, to varying degrees, tried to escape the condition of mutually assured destruction. So, you referenced missile defenses. The United States has this incredibly kind of strange Lovian idea of damage limitation, which is this idea that America is very idiosyncratic in how we do nuclear strategy, and one of our main objectives has been to both assure our allies, assure ourselves that we would run risks, and have freedom of maneuver by holding at risk, which is this jargony term that just says we'll have the ability to hit and destroy the other side's nuclear weapons, right? And you can start to see why that undermines the logic of the nuclear revolution. Because if you and I both have nukes, but I think I can destroy your weapons, or destroy most of your weapons, that makes me think that actually maybe this mutually assured destruction situation is maybe somewhat manageable. And even if you hit me back and have limited damage by destroying most of your weapons, and maybe my missile defenses can soak up whatever I can't destroy and you launch at me, maybe I can run that risk, right? Maybe it's a better outcome for me than the alternative reality where I accept that condition. And that continues to be, I think, a story in this third nuclear age, which is how will the United States in particular manage this? Because most other nuclear states, I think, don't have this particular approach. The big question now is, are things also beginning to change in China and Russia in particular? India and Pakistan are an interesting case. India has been frustrated by its freedom for maneuver being limited by Pakistani nuclear weapons. So this story of nuclear revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries, as you nicely put it, I think, is going to continue and to be with us as technologies change.
So bringing that into the present day and the Golden Dome concept, how should we understand this in the longer history of this revolutionary, counter-revolutionary dynamic? It's obviously an attempt to escape the logic of mutually assured destruction to reduce vulnerability. Is this a different type of proposal than we've seen before? How would you sort of play out this potential deployment of this capability? Is it even realistic? Is it a great idea or the greatest idea ever? Feel free to weigh in.
Well, so look, Golden Dome, it's not one thing. It's a system of systems. It's going to be, at least in the way it's written in the executive order that showed up in January, it's going to be everything, right? It's going to be the most ambitious American approach to missile defense, actually in excess of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars vision from the 1980s, which was similar. What's different about Golden Dome is that it's coming at a very different technological time. And this is where the technology change really matters, because in the 1980s, the cost of getting a single kilogram of payload to low Earth orbit through spacelift capability was astonishingly expensive compared to today with launch providers like SpaceX and others. And so there's this optimism that, during the 1980s, Reagan had this vision, but it wasn't the idea that we could actually do it at a feasible level of cost. But now we're legitimately having a conversation is this within reach? I mean, even if we need thousands of interceptors deployed in low Earth orbit, which is basically what you would need to even protect the homeland against a limited ballistic missile strike from just North Korea, forget Russia and China, could you do it because the costs have come down? I still think you can't do it because you have to scale up, right? I mean, the moment you're talking about scaling up and you have to replace these satellites in low Earth orbit because they will decay, orbit is not a permanent condition, and especially the physics of doing missile defense against missiles as they rise, that there's a lot of considerations about how low you want to be. The lower you are, the closer you are to the rising missile. But the lower you are, the faster you decay in orbit. So there's a lot of complicated math that you have to do. And then there are going to be other capabilities that are built into it. Drone defense, cruise missile defense, hypersonic glide missile defense. And there's part of the Golden Dome, there are parts of the Golden Dome that I might be okay with, like I think cooperating with allies, theater missile defenses, which don't undermine this condition of mutual vulnerability. That's all fine. And maybe even protecting particularly sensitive targets on the homeland, like nuclear command and control targets, the central nervous system of any nuclear force. That could be fine. But Golden Dome, as it's articulated for me, it's pretty simple. It's kindling for a three-way arms race.
That takes us to sort of the expectation of an actual use under these circumstances that kind of departs from the logic of the earlier nuclear age and perhaps eviscerates this idea of a nuclear taboo, which I think had prevailed for quite a long period of time, this idea that it's unthinkable, given this well-known condition of mutually assured destruction, that any rational decision maker would elect to potentially end life as we know it on this planet. And I think that, as you point out really persuasively in the book, this betrays a very kind of human type of predilection towards having a hard time reasoning about low probability outcomes, something that behavioral economists have spent a lot of time thinking about, putting us in a condition of what could be called Knightian uncertainty, where we really can't quantify the parameters that ought to go into our model for thinking about what's likely to go on. And I guess, what's your sense of the current status of the nuclear taboo? Are we so far away from the one case of nuclear use and so much closer in terms of the diffusion of the capability that you think that there's no longer really a normative break on the potential slide into a nuclear conflict? Or how should we think about this normative constraint on nuclear use?
Yeah, so the nuclear taboo is a really interesting and important idea that I think continues to be contested, right? Because we have taboos in society. We have taboos in the realm of weaponry, right? Chemical weapons, biological weapons. We have we have very, very successful proliferated conventions, basically banning these weapons because we determined as a species that these were just simply revulsive ways to inflict death even in a time of war. And we have laws of war. We have certain ways of fighting war that we've deemed to be more legitimate than others, permissible, essentially. And nuclear weapons are in this interesting space today because there is a contestation internally about, are nuclear weapons indeed legitimate, right? The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I described, it does many things to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. One of the things it does not categorically do is delegitimize nuclear deterrence, because it, of course, legitimizes the countries that possess nuclear weapons, that detonated nuclear devices before January 1st, 1967. That's the NPT definition of whether or not you get to be considered a legal nuclear state. But what you're asking about is, the next person to find themselves in a position where nuclear weapons might look like a tempting solution to whatever military or political problem they might be facing in a time of war is going to have to ask this question about ending 80 years of non-use. And of course, the horror of what Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented. The journalist John Hershey, who wrote Hiroshima, arguably one of the most important works of journalism of the 20th century, where he pointed out essentially that these were not just bigger bombs in the vein of the strategic bombing that had taken place in the Second World War, the firebombing of Tokyo, but that these were weapons that inflicted radiation sickness, that had these horrific effects on human bodies. In a way, what's paradoxical about that is that, of course, it has seeded this long-standing revulsion about nuclear weapons that seeds to this day the disarmament movement, which will remain with us. But it also makes nuclear deterrence fundamentally work, because it is that root word in that word deterrence, terror, deterre. Like the Latin root is terror. It is that horrific nature of nuclear use that makes deterrence work. And then going back to the taboo idea, we have large, very well-funded establishments in the nuclear states that are charged with making sure that these weapons are usable and that we believe that they are usable. So the taboo for me explains some of this, but not all of it, because in a way what we have is really a tradition of non-use. These weapons have not been used in 80 years, so the next person to make that decision, next national leader, will have to decide about their role in history, and that is a powerful effect in limiting them from going there. But ultimately, I would say that, the thinkability of nuclear use does remain, even if it is incredibly undesirable and would probably only happen in extreme circumstances that probably are unknown to national leaders in peacetime.
So speaking of extant national leaders in peacetime, sitting here in Washington, it's inevitable that we think about the person in the Oval Office who's in the seat now and would be confronted with these decisions. And I recall a statement earlier on when candidate Trump was asked about the nuclear triad, and he offered, I think, to me, nuclear is just the power. The devastation is very important to me. And then, of course, he also said something in tension with that, or perhaps even contradicting it, which is that the biggest problem we have today is nuclear proliferation, and having some maniac, having some madman go out and get a nuclear weapon. So we hear both this kind of adulation and awe at the power of nuclear weapons, but also this sense that it would be insane to use them. And I'm wondering, what's your sense of the likelihood of rational decision-making here in Washington, to the extent that we know a lot more about Trump's thinking than we do about, say, Xi Jinping's or perhaps Putin's, which we can get into? What kind of dynamic are we experiencing now in this space?
Yeah. So I'll answer your question, but I just want to point out one thing that I try to get to in the book, which is that I think it's often underappreciated that, we have 9 centers of decision-making around the world today, and in most of them, the authority to use nuclear weapons rests with a single human being, with very little external checks, including here in the United States, where analysts will sometimes describe, we are a democracy, a democratic republic, but when it comes to nuclear decision-making, we are effectively a monarchy. The Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs have no role to play. It is the president's alone. The National Military Command Center would receive an order that would be faithfully executed as long as it was valid and legal. And so it is important to think about this one person's psychological perspective on these issues. And Donald Trump is interesting. I mean, I will not claim to understand his psyche on a deep level, but, he has a record going all the way back to the 1980s of expressing a very kind of traditional Cold War American view of nuclear war. In a way very similar to Ronald Reagan, in his sense that nuclear weapons are important to U.S. national security. The devastation is very important to me is sort of a crass way to put it, but it's this idea that, that devastation underpins deterrence, as we've just been talking about. But at the same time, he doesn't want to see these weapons proliferate. He told the New York Times in 1984, I believe, that one of his greatest dreams in life was to negotiate an arms control agreement. He's proposed nuclear disarmament in that kind of Reaganist way that sort of Ronald Reagan explored in the 1980s with Mikhail Gorbachev. So this is all to say that despite his approach to kind of portray his willingness to take risks, Trump strikes me as somebody that's actually fundamentally terrified of nuclear war. And so on balance, that could backfire in a serious crisis where you could imagine that fear could lead to decision-making that causes escalation. But generally speaking, in peacetime, it could also lead to a place where Donald Trump is willing to throw out many of the traditional shibboleths that have kept the United States from maybe proposing certain ideas on arms control, like missile defense has been one of these so-called holy cows that the United States has been unable to directly put on the table for limitations since we left the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, which was a Cold War treaty that limited the numbers of ballistic missile systems that the U.S. and the Soviet Union and later Russia would possess. So maybe Trump decides that he really does value arms control. As he said to the New York Times, if he wants to accomplish that dream, he will start thinking about ideas. But there are risks here as well because the U.S. nuclear deterrent serves many functions. It doesn't just protect the United States. It reassures more than 30 allies around the world. And so if Trump does something in a way that's perceived by these allies to potentially compromise their security, that could also open Pandora's box on nuclear proliferation.
Excellent. And I want to get back to that relationship among allies, presumably covered under U.S. extended deterrence commitments. But let's take a short break now, and we will be back in just a moment.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show.
We're back, and what I want to do with our remaining time, Ankit, is think about some of the flashpoints, the regions and relationships that are most prone to potential nuclear crisis. And we've touched on a couple of these, and I wonder what you can offer us on, I suppose, the most recent event that has spurred a lot of thinking and worry about what kind of nuclear dynamics are in play today, which was the exchange between India and Pakistan just a few weeks ago. And I wonder if you could also splice into that how we ought to think about the role of China and its relationship with India and Pakistan. Is this a regional level three-body problem that we've thought through sufficiently?
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. That's a really good one. So the first thing to say is that the information environment around what exactly happened during those 4 days in May remains somewhat shrouded in a lack of clarity. But what I can say is that this was the most intense multimodal warfighting. By that I mean, we saw aircraft, missiles, artillery, cyber attacks, all taking place at once. But the most intense multimodal warfighting between two nuclear-armed states ever. We've never seen anything like this in the nuclear age, right? And so that in itself is concerning because anytime kinetic exchanges start between nuclear-armed states, I think you've essentially immeasurably increased the risk of nuclear war. But what's also interesting is that India and Pakistan actually managed this crisis between them rather carefully. So the Indians, I think, in part due to their acquisition of more advanced military capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, precision munitions, felt like they had the ability to dose damage rather precisely and hit a number of targets in Pakistan that they meant to hit. And they felt like they were limiting the possibility of inadvertent or unintentional escalation. And also, now these two countries have coexisted as nuclear-armed neighbors for more than 25 years. They have something of a sense of an understanding of each other's core red lines. One of the most famous red lines for the Pakistanis, for instance, who have a low threshold for nuclear use, Pakistan being the conventionally inferior party, would rely on its nuclear weapons earlier to deter India. But one of the most famous Pakistani red lines would be an Indian ground mobilization, which did not happen in this crisis. And so, in hindsight, the nuclear risks here, I think, were attenuated, but you have to imagine what could have happened if escalation had not terminated after 4 days. I think some of us are calling this the 87 or 88-hour near war, but it could have gone on. And potentially we were a few rungs away from Pakistan beginning to move nuclear weapons around. Perhaps the Pakistanis did do that, and that is why the United States was catalyzed into diffusing this crisis. We won't know the full story, I suspect, for potentially a decade or two to come when the military leaders and political leaders who lived through this retire and write their memoirs. But that is my initial read. And then the China piece is really interesting because China, of course, has very different relations with India and Pakistan. It is a competitor of India with a border dispute and direct clashes. We also, had a remarkable instance, I guess almost exactly 5 years ago when you had two nuclear-armed neighbors fighting with sticks and stones, quite literally, in the Galwan Valley along the disputed India-China border. But China and India have their own challenges. They don't have any direct process of risk reduction or arms control. And meanwhile, China sold Pakistan many of the exquisite military capabilities that helped the Pakistanis, I feel like. They respond to India's attacks. And this asymmetry, I think, really does manifest. And then China, even as it is a rising power, I think hasn't quite come around to feeling like it has a role to play in de-escalating or diffusing crises between India and Pakistan. That has still been left up to the United States. But your point about the linkages here is really important, because I would argue that the second nuclear age was this period when you had this three-body problem in southern Asia between India, Pakistan, and China. All three had nuclear weapons for most of the second nuclear age after 1998. What's interesting today is that the linkages between all three of these countries and the broader nuclear environment are stronger. So as we talked about, China is building up. China's building more advanced capabilities to deal with the United States, to deter the United States from intervening in a war over Taiwan. Many of those capabilities that China is building, to include precision conventional missiles, missile defense systems even, are starting to now weigh on India's ability to feel secure about its second strike capabilities. And in turn, Pakistan is going to react to what India ends up doing. The Biden administration, before they left office, pointed out that Pakistan is building longer-range missiles that the U.S. is now considering to be potentially a threat to the U.S. homeland, which was somewhat remarkable. But it just shows you how many of these linkages come full circle. In a way, the three-body problem could undersell this, because maybe you have something of a 5 or 6 or even 9-body relationship now, that these multipolar linkages are growing stronger by the year, and that doing arms control and fundamentally rendering this enterprise of nuclear deterrence that these countries rely on safer will require incredibly ambitious and politically very difficult to do forms of engagement.
Mm-hmm. Extending the discussion on China and touching on extended deterrence now, I think that's a really important reality in South Asia, that there are no explicit commitments for many of the external powers to be involved. And in fact, they have had clashes in which China has been conspicuously absent, if posturing for potentially being involved. Whereas when we look at the Taiwan Strait and the sort of triangular dynamics there among China, the U.S., and Taiwan, there's some ambiguity about, of course, what the level of U.S. strategic commitment to that is. And I wonder how should we think about the potential for nuclear escalation in Taiwan scenarios? As I mentioned, there's a lot of attention given to this subject, and in most cases, you sort of set aside this possibility of nuclear escalation and you game out all the different conventional fires that could be exchanged and all the tits for tats that could potentially achieve some type of escalation dominance and keep it a limited local war, to use the Chinese doctrinal term. How realistic is that in this scenario? What's changing in your mind about the dynamics there, given the speed and scope of China's nuclear modernization and expansion? What should we know about this?
Yeah, this is a really important question that I think could be an entire podcast discussion onto itself. But very briefly, what I'll say is that I think one of the rationales, and this is hotly debated in Washington because China has not told us why they're building more nuclear weapons, but I think one of the rationales is fundamentally that I think China on some levels understands that decades of American history in dealing with Russia, including what's happened in Ukraine, which postdates the Chinese nuclear buildup. It came before the Ukraine war. But it shows that when the United States deals with a superpower adversary that has a large survivable nuclear force, which China frankly didn't have. I mean, low 200s, as we said, that was not a large enough Chinese nuclear force to really be survivable, I think, against the totality of U.S. capabilities. But having a larger force would give the U.S. pause in intervening, because any prudent American leader or military planner would have to consider that warfare being a fundamentally unpredictable enterprise, that the possibility of nuclear escalation would loom. So if you leave nuclear escalation out of your war gaming in peacetime, I'm sure it makes it easier to run a war game, and it's psychologically potentially a little bit more comfortable, because you can actually imagine, as the United States, hitting targets on the Chinese homeland to achieve your military goals. But you're really doing yourself a disservice, because this is a real feature of this relationship that you have to account for. The second thing I'll say is the conventional military balance matters here. And this two-peer environment, the three-body problem we've talked about, also matters. Because now in Washington, there are two big sources of anxiety that are rising. The first is that we in the United States are not going to be conventionally dominant in the Indo-Pacific to at least the level that we have grown accustomed to in the 1990s and the 2000s. And our ability to defend Taiwan, to accomplish military objectives, will be severely hamstrung. And that's going to grow worse if China destroys American bases, interdicts the ability of the United States to carry out forward conventional operations. And so in that scenario, there is a legacy of strategic thought in the United States dating back to the 1950s that has a very traditional answer to this problem of conventional inferiority, locally in theater. which is that you rely on nuclear weapons to offset that, which would mean that the United States, which has never ruled out the option of using nuclear weapons first, might look into its nuclear quiver if there is a Chinese invasion flotilla amassing, for instance. So that's the first thing. I don't know whether an American president would opt for that option, but I can certainly imagine a military advisor days or weeks into a war where the U.S. Navy and Air Force have been severely degraded in the Indo-Pacific, presenting such an option to a president. Nobody knows what that president would do, but this is a consideration now, and this is active in debates in Washington. The second issue is what we're talking about in Washington as opportunistic or horizontal escalation, which is related to this idea of conventional inferiority, which is that for us in the United States, as a global hegemon with interests in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific regions, our conventional inferiority and resource limitations will mean that we cannot accomplish necessarily all of our deterrence goals with conventional forces in two theaters at once. And so again, the American strategic history here points us to the direction of nuclear weapons. If you can't do everything with your non-nuclear military forces in Asia and Europe, in one of those theaters you will become more reliant on nuclear weapons. And so these are uncomfortable questions. And then on the Chinese side, if you look at what they are building, China has never talked about tactical nuclear weapons or non-strategic nuclear weapons, but they have theater nuclear weapons. So it's this idea that Chinese leaders don't want to be in a place where they would have to choose between surrender or suicide, i.e. hitting the U.S. homeland and going all in, or completely capitulating. And so they are developing these limited options, potentially to have the ability to use nuclear weapons against Guam, let's say, to degrade the ability of the United States to sustain operations. So these dynamics between the two countries, I think, are underappreciated, but they absolutely need to be at the center. I don't take a strong position on whether or not we are in a second Cold War with China, but I often hear this assertion made in Washington. And I often find it perplexing that even as people are happy to make this observation that the U.S.-China dynamic today is a second Cold War, they set aside arguably one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War, which was that prospect of Armageddon looming over the United States and the Soviet Union. So U.S.-China nuclear dynamics, I think, absolutely need to be at the center of the conversations we have in this country about the risks that we would or would not run in accomplishing our national goals.
Duly noted, especially in a circumstance where, as you're saying, the most likely uses would be in a theater not so close to the U.S. homeland, and would really drive the question of what's an appropriate retaliatory measure, how much asymmetry is there in that relationship. And I think it really should give caution to our thinking about how credible nuclear use is in those scenarios.
Well, and the other thing I would add is, as you said earlier, night in uncertainty. None of us know how nuclear escalation looks. We have all fought the same number of nuclear wars. And so that should be a tremendous source of humility. And even if we have modeling and war games that tell us that maybe we can control escalation, and maybe if rational game theoretical modeling even tells us that Chinese leaders and American leaders would have a very good reason to stop shooting after a nuclear war begins in theater against military targets, we cannot take that as guaranteed. And so you have to essentially recognize in peacetime that these burdens will shape the kinds of decisions national leaders will be called to make in a time of crisis.
Yeah, and just to emphasize that point, we have the same experience with nuclear war, which is to say zero, as you pointed out earlier. Obviously, the use in 1945 wasn't a nuclear war among nuclear-armed adversaries, and so none of the particular strategic lessons from that obviously apply in the contemporary scenario. One last contemporary scenario, and we certainly could talk about others, unfortunately, but I want to understand a little bit better Russia's nuclear signaling in the context of the Ukraine war. And here we also have some recent events that I'm curious if you could weigh in on, which is this sensational surprise drone attack on a lot of Russian strategic air capability by Ukraine just earlier in May this year. What have we learned in the context of this crisis? Much more overt nuclear saber rattling than I certainly have experienced in my lifetime. What is this story? Where does it leave us?
Sure. So the essential mechanism of nuclear deterrence is risk, right? It is a feature, not a bug, that anytime a nuclear armed state goes to war, things could get out of control. And this has been essentially at the core of Russia's approach to nuclear saber rattling, right? I would use the term signaling or messaging, whatever you want to call it. Russia has tried to provide reminders to the West that nuclear weapons are hanging over this crisis, even if it is a proxy conflict. But I would also argue that Russia's nuclear deterrence has had limitations, just as NATO's nuclear deterrence has had limitations, right? Deterrence enables both countries to pursue their national objectives only up to a point, at which point it frustrates their ability to pursue their national objectives. So Russia has not been able to prosecute its war on Ukraine with complete impunity because the West has continued to supply and support Ukraine, shielded by NATO's nuclear deterrent. Even as equipment going into Ukraine is being gathered in Poland and Romania, Russian cruise missiles are not hitting those depots, right, because of NATO's nuclear deterrent. But at the same time, as we talked about earlier, NATO and many of us here have been horrified to watch the level of suffering in Ukraine, and we've been unable to put boots on the ground or a no-fly zone over Ukraine to support Ukraine directly, recognizing that there would be a risk of nuclear war and that Ukraine is not a formal member of the NATO alliance. And so the lessons about nuclear deterrence here, I think, are actually rather nuanced, right? It's not that deterrence worked or it didn't work, as some people like to argue. And Vladimir Putin is a rather thoughtful manipulator of risk, I think. I think he's an old Cold Warrior. He's thought deeply about the role that nuclear weapons play in Russia's national strategy. I think he's been deeply frustrated by some of these failures of deterrence, which is why we see Russia's doctrinal revision last year, which is interesting. I'll come to Operation Spiderweb, this drone attack, in a moment. But one of the things the Russians included in their doctrinal revision was a mass aerospace attack to include drones. Except the language they use suggested that such an attack would originate outside of their borders, which, of course, turned out to be not the case with what we just saw. But let me now move to the drone attack. So I talked about earlier India and Pakistan a few weeks ago, first and most intense multimodal air war between two nuclear-armed neighbors. The other big first we had, and this all happened in less than a month, is arguably what the Ukrainians pulled off was the largest attack in history by a non-nuclear, or by any country, against a nuclear state's nuclear delivery systems. Because the Ukrainians hit a number of Russian air bases that support dual-capable bombers that are capable of delivering not only cruise missiles and bombs against Ukrainian cities, but also, if they were ever called to, potentially nuclear weapons. And we've never seen this kind of damage against a country's nuclear forces. And it's all the more remarkable that the Ukrainians are a non-nuclear country doing this. So, two observations here. First is that Ukraine has been in an existential conflict since February 2022. And so this idea of running risks that could generate nuclear escalation against Ukraine is not a major consideration if you're already in an existential war. I've been told many times by Ukrainian contacts that even if Russia were to use use nuclear weapons in a limited way, it wouldn't have the effect on Ukrainian morale that Russia would necessarily seek because the stakes for Ukraine are already limitless. Of course, for the West, it's different. And this has been one of the key divergences that I think has affected the discourse here in Washington about what should be done to support Ukraine and at what pace, is because the West fundamentally has a different set of interests here, which is the stakes for NATO and the United States are not limitless in this conflict. And so now there is this expectation that Russia will retaliate. But I would also caution against overlearning these lessons, because I think now there are going to be commentaries written that, drones are going to revolutionize nuclear deterrence and bombers are never going to be survivable again. I think there were a lot of idiosyncrasies about the Russia-Ukraine relationship, about Ukraine's approach to covert operations and human intelligence that enabled this remarkable kind of Trojan horse-style infiltration of Russia. But also, the Russians were not parking these bombers inside hardened shelters. There were a lot of operational factors that enabled this tremendous display. And for me, the bottom line here is political, right? It comes back to the debate in Washington about whether or not President Zelensky has cards or not. And I think he's clearly demonstrated that Ukrainian ingenuity, this is the biggest show of ingenuity since the campaign to go into Kursk, that Ukraine clearly does have cards to play, and that they can asymmetrically compete with a much larger and more capable military force, even as the picture on the battlefield in Ukraine is looking grimmer for Ukraine than it was a year ago.
Fascinating, and certainly a dynamic to keep watching. And while I would love to cover North Korea and Iran, I think we should move now to some of the prescriptions that you've offered in the book. And I guess I'm struck by the point you made earlier about the last remaining arms control treaty, New START, set to expire February 26th. Is that the beginning of the end for arms control? What are your expectations in this new era for the potential for tamping down some of these dynamics that have been so worrisome. As you pointed out, we went from a high of 70,000 warheads deployed to a much lower number now, but seem to be creeping back up. What are some of the ways that you've been prescribing that might actually get this under greater control, introduce some more stability into the system?
Yeah, so the prescriptive note on which the book ends deals with several ideas to, first of all, avoid making things worse. Nuclear testing is a big one. There's a lot of talk in the United States and Russia and behavior in China suggesting preparation for nuclear testing. We should avoid that. But on arms control, analytically, I would make the observation that unfortunately things will get worse before they get better. But I strongly come out in the book in support of the idea that arms control continues to be a useful tool in the national security toolkit, not just for the United States, but for every country that possesses nuclear weapons. Because ultimately, you need this predicate condition to do arms control, which is mutual interest, right? We did not get to this with the Soviet Union for the first two and a half decades of the Cold War. It took a long time. It took a Cuban Missile Crisis. I would never prescribe that we should have a Cuban Missile Crisis again with China or Russia, because, of course, if you roll the dice on the Cuban Missile Crisis enough times, you don't live all of those times, right? And so the hope is that as we sort of enter this period of arms racing, that people in these various systems, in the Chinese system, in the American system, the Russian system, will recognize that arms racing is ultimately a bridge to nowhere, that absolute security cannot be gained, that the condition of vulnerability cannot fundamentally be negated despite technological changes, and the best way to control the costs of military competition in peacetime will still be to sit down with each other and try to identify certain limits. Verification is also important, but I also argue in the book that the standards of verification to which we've grown accustomed in the United States in arms control may not be attainable in the future. And so we might need to think about new modalities, new technologies to do verification in arms control. But this is an idea that goes against the grain, because in Washington and Europe these days, you will hear the idea that arms control is dead. And that strikes me as a limitation on our own national toolkits to deal with these very difficult problems. And I always like to say that arms control is an accompaniment to deterrence. There is essentially, we should imagine stability as a three-legged stool, of which one of the legs is deterrence, one of the legs is arms control, and the other leg is diplomacy. And if you don't have all three of those legs, you're not really sitting on a very stable stool. And unfortunately, I think for the coming years, the deterrence leg will be where a lot of the resources and energy go. But perhaps enough wobbling will convince the major players that those other two legs do need to be bolstered, and that is ultimately the case for engagement. And the alternative to not doing arms control is that we just tolerate this world of growing nuclear risks. And of course, as we learned during the Cold War, allowing the enterprise of deterrence to remain essentially unconstrained is just simply too risky. It all goes back to that risk, which is inherent in deterrence. It is the core feature of deterrence is risk. Risk is desirable. It is a feature. And so even when we talk about risk reduction, we don't want to reduce too much risk for the countries that rely on nuclear deterrence because they need some risk for it to work. It's more about the matter of finding optimal risk or optimal instability, and that's where I think arms control and diplomacy really help. Arms control isn't this kind of liberal fantasy that's out there to make us all feel good. It really has a core effect that is complementary to deterrence and complementary to making sure that if nuclear weapons will continue to exist, that we are effectively managing these risks as a species. Because as you put it, the alternative is that we wipe ourselves out over a long enough timeline.
Well, thank you for laying this out in such lucid terms. I think the idea of accepting some risk, accepting the condition of vulnerability has this sort of creates a type of political distaste. And I think we can understand the drive for whether it's Star Wars or Golden Dome in that context. And I think your effort to reframe the efforts toward arms control, towards confidence building measure is not some sort of, wimpy idealism, but rather as self-interested realpolitik, a way of actually ensuring your survival fundamentally is it's a really important lesson, and we should be embracing that vulnerability. And so while I usually wouldn't be identified as a panda hugger, I would be more than happy to be a panda hugger in this context. I think you're really showing how vulnerability can be quite a strength. and contribute overall not just to U.S. national security, but to avoiding Armageddon, as you've so persuasively laid out. So, Ankit, thank you so much for joining us today, and bring it in for a hug.
Thanks, Ben.
You've been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed here are those of the host and guest panelists, and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie Podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Hewan Park is our executive producer and audio engineer. I'm Isaac Kardon, senior fellow in the Asia program, and the host of this episode of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.